Okay, now for the electronics, this is how the wiring is. My receiver here is like pretty dirty, but what I've had to do is I've had to solder on all these wire connections. So this back one for this back, that's for the servo, and then the forward one, which is actually on that second row, I don't know how easy that is to see, is for the ESC. So putting that in there, you want to plug in the motor back here. It's just a JST connector. I forget exactly what kind of JST, but it's like really common for RC stuff. And then this is kind of the setup you want to have, where and then also plug in the servo here. I forgot to do that. Okay, but this is the setup you want. We've got everything very compact, close on the side. All of these wires are kind of been just bent into place over just kind of sitting in place for a while. Now this will lead off outside, sticking out the side pod inlet, and everything will just kind of rest in there. For the battery, now this goes in this remaining slot. Then we'll plug in, and now all the wires, they want to pop out, so when you actually do put on the body, you're gonna have to scrunch everything down and fit everything on. It's not the ideal setup, but it's kind of the only way it works. Okay, so now I'm gonna put on the heatsink. This part is, really not necessary. Like, there's like zero airflow, so having a heatsink is not 100% necessary. I ran like a static test where I just like ran a motor for 10 minutes and checked the temperatures, and I found that a heatsink was marginally better than not having a heatsink, but that was just, my testing. It wasn't moving at all. Yeah, okay, so hopefully you could also see how I put on the body there. Everything is inside. The back does kind of pop up a little bit. I think that's just because the electronics don't really love being squished. And then this little, the on-off button just kind of fits snug on the side. It's not fixed or anything. I want it to be able to come out, for later, just in case. Okay, so now, moving on to the rear wing. The rear wing has this tiny little piece that juts out, and there's also a little part like that on the floor here. And so, go ahead and put a little bit of glue down, and make sure that it's all lined up. Oop. And now I'll just let that sit there for enough time for it to dry, and I'm just gonna pull this wire out of the way for now, but eventually what I'm gonna do is have it go through the little uprights that are in the middle here, which do absolutely nothing but are for the style point. Okay, so now this rear wing should stay on there pretty nicely. Go ahead and let that dry, but I can do other stuff while it's drying. So now moving on to the rear suspension, which recently dried. Take 2 washers, put them on either side, and then take these regular nuts right here. These are the larger ones, not the M3s and screw those on, and you want them to get very close to the sides, but not actually put any pressure on the sides, because what will happen is it'll lock up. But you want it to be very close, just so that the outer nuts will be able to fit on. Okay, so now we have our rear tires. Go ahead and put those on. On the inside of the tire, there's like a receptor for that nut, and so now it'll fit. And again, just kind of, I like to roll it until you start to feel like some kind of tension, and then roll it back a little bit, just to make sure you don't lock up your whole rear end. And you'll know immediately if you did it wrong, if you start driving it and the whole thing, locks up. Okay, so now we take one of these, which is one of these, it's got like a little, kind of like a star piece at the very end. It's a self-locking nut, so when you tighten it on there, it will put a lot of pressure on the nut, and it won't be able to come out of place. So these are very important part right here. You can't use the type that has a nylon what am I trying to say? A nylon like washer. Like these tiny M3 ones have a little nylon piece in there, which generates a lot of friction, so they can't really come off. But you can't use them on the back just because of how narrow the actual axle is, which is just unfortunate. That's just kind of what happens because of the particular axle I'm using. If you were to, take a longer piece of the of that axle, and if you cut it longer, you could probably use a different kind of nut if you really wanted to. But for me, and for what was at my hardware store, that was the only one, and I've found it works a little better. Okay. So for these pieces are just the rear like hubs. So of course on the 2022 cars, it's a flat plane on the outer edge of the tire. If I remember correctly, they stay stationary, or no, all of them roll. That's the thing. But so on the rear they do roll, and they have their own nut receptor on the inside, and it's printed with a very little tolerance, and so it should be able to friction fit. If it's not perfect, what I found is if you take a little bit of hot glue and you put it in there and you squash it down very far, and just let it dry and then try to fit it on, it will act kind of like a little rubber spacer, and will keep it on for a lot longer. Okay, so now for the front wing, obviously this goes on right here. What I found is sometimes this piece will print out a little tiny bit too tall, sometimes it doesn't, but if it is too tall, you can just file it down a little bit, and then just so that the front wing is flush. Yep, so that's how it goes. Now for our front wheels, because the super glue is still a little bit dry, I'm going to have to be careful. Still a little bit wet, sorry. But just go ahead and put the wheel over the top of that, and take our little M3 with the nylon, start screwing that on, and use my multi-tool. And now for this one, you kind of, like the back, you have to eyeball it, and you just want it to, you don't want it to clamp it, you just want it to be close enough that, you know, the wheel isn't going to oscillate, it's just going to be able to roll. Okay, so that's pretty much what it is. Do the same on the other side. Sometimes you just have to go back and forth a little bit just to get it between rolling and getting stuck and oscillating, just to find the perfect balance. Okay, and now the wheels are on. If it's not, if you don't like the toe, what you kind of have to do is you have to bend this wire, make it narrower or wider. You want to have a good amount of extra space. It's totally fine to have too much. If you have too little though, then you can't really do anything. Okay, and to finish our car off here, we've got our front hub pieces, and for these ones, they do not roll, unfortunately. I tried to make it so it was incorporated, but what I found is it looks way better if they're stationary, because then it can actually hold on to that nut, and you know, it just looks a lot nicer. So, you know, not entirely realistic, but you won't even be able to tell. Okay, so now we are done. Now we just need to test it, and the car works alright, so perfect. Alright, well, thank you for tuning in to this tutorial.